Welcome, everybody, to this panel on second-generation pastors. We'll be focusing on culture and race in ministry. My name is Daniel Lee. I am the academic dean for the Center for Asian American Theology Ministry, which is a different center than the Korean Study Center, because the Asian American space is kind of organized a little bit differently. But we try to work really closely with the Korean Study Center, and we're very happy to work closely, especially in panels like this. And I'll be delivering on the paper tomorrow as well. So anyways, let me introduce the panelists. We're just very excited to have this panel give a very different perspective. I think initially we were thinking about this being an EM panel, but as you know, the later generations, the EM context is actually a lot more dynamic. So people are not necessarily staying in EMs. It might be independent EM. It might be multi-ethnic. It might be all kinds of different things, right? So in the broader sense, we're talking about the general sense of second-generation pastoral ministry. So I think we can kind of frame it that way. So I will start from Reverend Dr. Benjamin Shin, who's a teaching pastor at New Life Vision Church in Glendale, California. He's also Associate Professor of Christian Ministry and Leadership at Talbot. We're very excited to have you here, Ben. And also Reverend Sam Ko, lead pastor of Hillside, LA, which is in East LA. It's in partnership with the current congregation called LA Christian Presbyterian Church. Thanks for being here, Sam. Nasanghangge. Yes. And Reverend Kevin Lee. He's an online pastor for Saddleback Church. You might have heard of this little church called Saddleback, multi-campus church that began in South Orange County, but I think we also have like campuses all over the world as well. Right, yeah. So very good to have all of you. What I wanted to do is start off by asking you just to kind of share your story a bit, about where you are, what the ministry context is, and also how you got there, so we can kind of situate your particular ministry context. So we'll start with Reverend Dr. Shin.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you for your attendance and everyone online. Born in Pasadena, not far from here, Huntington Memorial Hospital. Went to white churches all my life. Lake Avenue is my home church. And then I went to college at UCLA, and I felt a calling my third year in college through campus ministry. I was not intending to go to Korean church because I don't speak any Korean, even though I look fully Korean, and ended up at a small church in El Monte, served there for 15 years. And all of a sudden, I started realizing I'm Korean American. And that was a really good awakening for me. And now I love working in the Korean church. I'm currently at a church I've been at for now 5 years. I just celebrated 33 years of pastoral ministry on April 1st, which is April Fool's Day, which I always say, because of that, I'm a fool for Jesus.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Sam?
Hi, thank you for having me, everyone. My name is Sam Ko. I'm a son of a pastor, and my dad, I think he secretly prayed that I would be a pastor all his life. He told me that after I got into ministry. Do you believe that? Never asked me once to be a pastor. Was a 전도사 at many churches because of his connection with his friends. And finally ended up at Hillside, LA, which is the English ministry then at 나성한인교회, a Los Angeles Christian Presbyterian Church. And when I landed there, I was wondering before the Lord, why am I here? Because when I was there was about 15 English ministry members there, and it was a very broken ministry. The person who promised to come didn't come, and people were leaving one by one. And I asked myself, which many second-generation Korean American pastors ask, do I want to go back into a Korean church? And so the Lord, and there's a miraculous story to this, but he sent me there. And as I was praying in this huge parking lot, have you guys ever been there to 나성한인교회? There's a huge parking lot. No one can see me because it's so huge, and I'm praying. As I'm praying, there's this little kid from the community that was riding his bicycle, looked to the church, and he said, F this church, the full word, the 4-letter word. And I was like, oh, what would possess this little kid from the community to say these kind of curses at the church? Little to find out, I did some research. And there was a lot of divisions within the church. Actually, there was a time when the church was splitting that police were coming because there were a lot of issues that were going on. And the Lord started to put on my heart a vision for the community, to reach the community. And that's where my journey began. And I would like to share that a little bit more, later on as we go into the conversation, Daniel.
Great, thank you. Kevin.
Yeah, I'm grateful to be here as well. My name is Kevin Lee, and I was actually born in Korea, so raised up in the Korean church context. It came to the States when I was 11, so my mother tongue's Korean. My parents are still speaking to me in Korean. My closest friends are Korean-speaking, Korean American. So, and I grew up in the Korean American immigrant church context. Now serving at Saddleback Church, that's a very different church context. So my question was always, what is Korean and what is Korean American and what is American American? And this is my 6th year at Saddleback, and I think 2nd or 3rd year going into ministry at Saddleback. I think Lord helped me reframe that question and ask me, Kevin, don't ask about the cultural differences. Ask what is actually biblical. What does a biblical community look like? So I hope today I would identify myself as 1.5 generation Korean American. So I hope I can bring that perspective into today's conversation.
Great, thank you. You know what? I think I was thinking about this, and I don't think I put this on the list of questions, but Ben, you kind of kicked us off in thinking about this. How have you navigated your own identity? Because before we talk about ministry, in your own sense of kind of identity, because obviously it can be complicated. It can be a long journey of twists and turns. I would like to hear about this, and that would be helpful to kind of understand how you approach ministry, right? Because obviously, for me, even for myself, like it's been a long journey to come to be very comfortable in my own body and skin and in my culture as well. I grew up in a Korean American church. I guess I'm like a 1.5, I guess, or 1.7 or whatever. I came when I was 10. So I grew up in a Korean American church. I did Asian American church most of my life. And then, I did Korean American ministry. And then I did Asian American ministry. And then I went, once again, twists and turns. But I think that would help us as you comment on different things to see what's been for you just personally making sense of your Korean Americanness. Right? I mean, Ben, so we can kind of continue your thoughts.
So, born in Pasadena in the 60s, so I really thought I was white because I ate hot dogs all the time. And I don't speak a lick of Korean. So it wasn't until I went to college at UCLA, the University of Caucasians Lost Among Asians, that I actually started meeting Korean people, and they would bow to me and they would talk to me in Korean. I'm like, dude, I don't know what you're saying. So I think it was there in college that I started realizing my identity is I'm dual. I am American, I'm born here, 2nd generation, but I really am Korean. And I started appreciating it more and more. And what I appreciated is the community. I felt like I had a connection with Korean American people that I didn't have with my blonde, blue-eyed friends. So again, it was a generational thing and it was a time thing. But then when I was immersed in a place where I finally saw Koreans, because Pasadena back in the 60s, there was no 626. It was still 818 in terms of area code. So there were no Asians here. And especially at Lake Avenue Church, there were no Asians either. It was like 3 of us.
Okay. Thank you. Well, Sam, tell us more about that, just in terms of what, because you grew up in the church, Sam, just in terms of you grew up in the church. I mean, were you comfortable with just being Korean American, just in terms of like, because you grew up in the, you were in the church, you were in the community, in the family and everything else?
Yeah, I didn't know any better. I love Korean food. I love my mom's cooking. And I love it when my mom goes, 맛있어, right? I mean, that's a part of me that is so Korean. No matter what I learn, no matter how I engage with other ethnicities, I always knew at the core of my being who I was. So I never had any questions on that. And I also received Korean love from my parents. So there was a deep grounding of who I was as a Korean and also American. So really, I didn't have too much confusion. And then later on in college, when I went to Biola, I joined the Korean American, group called BKSA, And so there, I was mentored by many hyungnims, and actually Ben was a huge part of that. So I grew up in that. And never really had any issues, although within my identity and firmly grasping my identity, my mind as I studied, it was increasingly more open to not only who I am, but what kind of impact that I can make as a Korean American. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Great, thank you.
I think for me, the journey is a little bit different because coming from Korea at 11, going through puberty, and just like you're very sensitive to how other people look at you. So for me, like when I look at white people, I see a difference. I know I can't fit in. I speak differently, even though I speak English. I look differently. So there was, I think I'm still in the process of grasping who I really am as a Korean American and what does that even mean. I remember I went to Korea maybe 10 years ago. So that would have been 10 years after I came to the States. And I went back to what I would call my own country, and they would see me differently. I asked in Korean, like to go to this place, do I have to stop? I was in a bus, and do I have to get off here? I asked it in Korean, like 여기서 내리면 돼요? And he answered back to me in English. And I was like, how am I supposed to? Because definitely he sees me different, even as a Korean. So, and I feel that in a white community. So I think I love the 1.5 generation because that's who I feel like I truly am. There's obviously great benefits to it. There's hardships around it, but I think I'm still in the journey.
See, but you and I are both technically 1.5 in a sense, right? And this is the thing. I think when I talk to a lot of Korean Americans, they talk about Korea, like my generation talk about Korea as though it's like it's stuck in time forever. They'll be like, well, you know how Korean people are. And what's weird is that if you talked about what Koreanness is for you, it's fundamentally different than what it is for me, but we start talking the same way. And of course, if you go to Korea and say, well, I mean, a student of mine said he went to Korea and he was shocked that Koreans were not what he thought Koreans should be. What is wrong with you? How come you don't fit the stereotype, right? Because the Korean American culture that I grew up with, the Korean culture that I grew up with, is Korean culture from the 70s and 80s. It's my parents is for Korean culture. And it's stuck in time in my head, and I keep on spitting back what I think is Korea. But Korea is changing so fast that even if you go back, you find this to be different. This is something that I think we kind of miss in terms of how we talk about this thing. Part of Orientalism, part of kind of limited scope of how we think about Korea, right? But this is really helpful because we're trying to understand how you relate with your identity. And of course, it's going to actually impact how we think about ministry as well, right? And who you minister to. So, all of you kind of had interactions with Korean American ministry or Korean American immigrant church. So reflecting upon that, what are some of the gifts, positive aspects of Korean American culture or spiritual heritage? We will talk about some of the challenging aspects of it. So at this point, we want to talk about some of the gifts that you've kind of grown up with. You feel like these are, we talked about Korean love or, different things, mentoring or whatever. What are some of the things that's been beneficial for you that you continue to see in your own pastoral formation? And you see the benefits of that in your ministry now as well. We'll start on this side with Kevin.
Yeah, I think for me, I think there's a lot that comes to mind, but one thing is valuing community over individual self has been huge for me. I think in growing up in Korea, you always identify yourself as who you are in the context of the family that you're in. And how your last name actually comes first in your name, things like that. So when I came to America, I thought I had to adopt the American culture, which which values individualism and the independence. And I thought I had to change my way of functioning or operating in this country. And that's what I did. So going to Korean American church, I felt like I had to adopt the American culture. But now that I'm at Saddleback, it's weird, but at Saddleback Church, I feel like I embrace my identity more as a Korean. Like when I was in Korean church, I wanted to do things like American. Like I went to conferences that were held by American churches. I wanted to look like them. I wanted to speak like them. And when I came to the American church, they actually liked me for being Korean. So I wanted to be more of myself. Like when I carry on a conversation, I still have accent. Like I can't go on in a long I can usually fake it for 5 minutes. People would think like I'm natural in English. I can fake it until first 5 minutes, and my accent will slip out. And I thought that was embarrassing for me, things like that. But at Saddleback, I was able to really embrace that. And part of that just comes from community affirming, things like that. And
Well, I have a follow-up question because we can imagine what we think is Saddleback. So you're an online pastor. Yeah. Like, who do you literally minister to? Because obviously, I know there are a lot of there are Asian Americans everywhere. So there's different campuses too. Yeah. So in your ministry context, who do you minister to? Yeah.
So I was an online pastor before COVID. There's a lot of online pastors now that COVID had kind of brought online ministry into the front end of the churches, but I was doing online ministry before then. So just because of our pastors' influence and our church's global kind of influence, we have small groups all around the world in different contexts, in Asia, in different countries. So I'm a pastor to them, to the small groups. So I'm helping those small groups to be healthy in our own definition in their cultural context. Yeah.
So it's a very diverse context globally.
Absolutely,
as well. Got it. Thank you. Pastor Sam.
For me, 새벽 기도 helped me a lot. I don't do 새벽 기도 anymore, but I should do it more. But that helped.
Are you serious, or are you just saying that?
No, it really did. I did 새벽 기도 for a long time, because I was a 전도사 before I became a pastor. But that helped me really with my spiritual disciplines. So that kind of connected me to another thing that I see that Koreans have an amazing knack for, and that is tenacity and commitment. Like I see a lot of pastors give up, but I saw my dad in ministry so difficult, especially during our time. And I think all of us, I shouldn't even be speaking to some of the pastors who are here because they know way more about the challenges and the difficulties. But I saw my dad never give up. I saw my dad's friends never give up. I saw 전도사님s, that really went to, be 부목사s never give up. And I was looking at that, I was like, wow, they're just so dedicated. So when I entered the ministry and I, going from place to place when I was about to finally land, and I finally landed at a certain place, I went through a lot, with in my present church, actually. If you know any of the history of what's going on at our church, it was very difficult for our members, myself. But I always held on to that Korean tenacity and that commitment. Although, I just heard a lecture right now from a lady who was sharing about, sometimes if you overcommit, sometimes, that could go a certain way, right? But I think overall that healthy commitment where you're just like, this is the Lord's church. If he tells me to stay here, I'm going to stay here. And I've been at this church for 14 years, which I never ever thought I could do on my own. And I know the Lord has, really placed these spiritual giants, Korean 목사님s. I really want to thank them too in showing us that. And then I think one more thing is education. Education. I used to never enjoy studying when I was a kid. I was always the person that always likes to play. I didn't do so well actually in high school, Ben, But as I was challenged by my dad to, continue higher education, I actually landed in Fuller and I did my THM here with Ralph Martin, the late Ralph Martin. And I learned so much from him. And he just expanded my mind in respect to the gospel. I really credit where I am right now with the very interesting ministry that's going on at our church right now to the devotion to education. And that is what I learned from my Korean American forefathers, the pastors, to really investigate why. Why am I doing this? Where am I right now? It's such a confusing thing. Like, Kevin, I appreciate what you're saying because, really, there could be a lot of confusion if we don't investigate. And where are we going next? This is where I'm most, really interested in. Where is the Korean American church going next? Where is its legacy? That's my question. I'm investigating and thinking about this all the time. Are we going to die just in EM, just doing just the EM stuff? Or what is the next vision that God has for us? And can we go deeper? That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Well, you can think of those things because you've been there for so long. Typical EM pastor, when there used to be EM pastors, a lot of you know it's impossible to find EM pastors now, but a lot of the EM pastors, they last 18 months. It's just they don't last because it's incredibly difficult, right? So, you can't think those questions if you don't last. And it's because you've been there for so long, I think you're going to...
And I wouldn't last without the modeling before me with the Korean American pastors, right? Yeah. Thank you, 목사님s. All the 목사님s that helped me to shape this thought,
Thank you, Sam. All right. Ben, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there are two words that come to mind when I think of the positive traits of Korean church. One is devotion, and the other one is commitment. And the devotion and commitment shows itself in, like you said, in Sebekido. Wow, that's a lot of commitment. I recently went to a church in December that, there were thousands of people at morning prayer. And I'm thinking, we're doing a godly practice at an ungodly hour. This is just unbelievable. But this was normal for them. And I thought, wow, and it was really beneficial to see. The other way that I saw devotion and commitment is to one another. One of the things that was just striking to me was going to funerals of members' parents, and the whole community would show up. They wouldn't probably know the parents, but because of the relationship through the members and then the extension to the parents, they would mourn with them, they would give, and they would empathize. And I thought, wow, I've never seen anything like that. That really was a clear example of the body of Christ. So devotion and commitment, I think, in my opinion, are two of the strongest traits that Koreans and Korean Americans as well are demonstrating in their lives.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. I wonder, because we're all, well, even though Kevin is pastoring all over the world, I think it's interesting to think about the fact that because we're in Southern California, and because I'm originally from Virginia, and when I came to Southern California, I was like, these Koreans are not the same Koreans I grew up with, right? So, if for those of you who are online, you probably want to think about this in terms of what that looks like and how we think about Korean American community and culture, depending on where you are in the country, because it does vary. Well, in thinking about that, so I'll start this next question with you, Sam. So in your ministry, we talked about some of the positive things, and there's obviously different aspects in which you've been blessed by the Korean American heritage, spiritually, and some cultural value as well. What are some of the challenges and issues that you see, in your church, maybe within yourself or members, or even broadly, right? Did you see in terms of kind of the, I guess, negative legacies of from the Korean American cultural context in your experience?
We could talk about a lot of these, Daniel, but in terms of the church context, right? I think the vision stops at being ethnocentric. That's where my greatest challenge is, because if we do any research on the history of the Japanese immigrant church or the Chinese immigrant church, we know that unless we really think about legacy, it just starts disappearing. So my question right now is like, I know you guys have educated us to think deeper about the next steps, like really looking further down the line in terms of legacy, right? As a Korean immigrant church and whatever now the next steps are, I don't think we're investigating that enough with the next generation, with us. We're not talking about it. We're not having healthy dialogue about, because we're the next generation, right? I would love to see the next generation continue even though our church is multi-ethnic, we now have 60% non-Koreans coming to Hillside. 60%. We're actually a minority of the Korean Americans. But yet, it's still a Korean American church with heritage. You know, some of our Hispanic members are eating Korean food and they're going to Korean classes. They're going to 한글학교. Yeah. This is an amazing thing for us to be able to at least give those kinds of opportunities, no? Like, this is just so amazing. This is still, although now Hillside is a community church, yet we are still able to continue and do the deeper things of the gospel, like racial reconciliation. I mean, these are the opportunities that we're giving to our non-Korean community right in our own backyard. I believe that's such a beautiful picture and a beautiful legacy. But I don't think we're talking about it enough, and we're a small, tiny little fraction of a percentage of Korean immigrant churches are actually thinking this way. So that's what I would say.
Thinking consciously about what does it mean in terms of our particular ethnic identity, actually, I guess to some degree problematizing it. Like, what do we do with this instead of just kind of taking it as a given in a sense? I think that's we'll get there. I think we'll get there. Kevin, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think for me, as I am trying to grasp my own identity as a Korean American, working at white church, a big church, a very famous, influential church, I think I brought on the system of how you treat your colleagues who are superior, older, in a meeting setting. So very practical things is like when you are in a meeting with other people, if they're older and if they're your supervisors or higher in the organization or chart, like I was told to not speak. Just be there, not speak, because if you speak, you won't be invited back, right? That's the Korean church setting, the ministry setting that I grew up with. So coming to Saddleback, I actually realized that if you're called into the meeting, if you don't speak, you're not called back in the next meeting. So I was in a meeting and it was about online ministry, so I had to speak. But it was a 30-minute meeting, and the elders were there, my supervisors were there, and I thought, even though it's about my ministry, I didn't want to speak for some reason. So elders were talking, and I wanted to talk, but I couldn't. I just couldn't. So after the meeting, I got so frustrated, so I called one of the people that were there that I felt comfortable sharing my feelings with, and I called him. He listened to me, and he was like, hey, Kevin, there is a reason why you were called into that meeting. And if you don't speak, we as a church is missing something. We'll miss something. And that's when I realized, my default attitude going into these meetings is to not speak. Because I want to honor and I want to show honor. And the expression of honor looks differently to Saddleback than I was at a Korean church. So I think that's I wouldn't say it's a weakness or a limitation, but I think it's something that I do need to change when I am in the American context. Yeah.
I mean, because obviously you're there to bring diversity. They literally have invited you and hired you for that reason as well, right?
When we were choosing seats here, I wanted to sit there. That's the default mindset. I want to be on the side, and Dr. Ben sat there, Sam sat here, and this was the only seat, and I wasn't comfortable with that. And so I still am, I think, grasping with that the cultural.
I did that purposely, actually.
Or you can look at it this way. That's number 1 seed, number 2 seed, number.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Thank you. Well, Ben, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, just because you've been in ministry for a long time and you've seen just pastorally, right? Just when you do pastoral care too, what that looks like. What have you gleaned in terms of your experience?
Well, I'll be honest. My goal, hopefully before I pass, would be to try and bring some positive reformation to the Korean American church. And God has given me the opportunity to do that through the role at the seminary. So I'm training future pastors. And let me just say, I've made so many mistakes in the Korean church. I never insulted people. I squeezed their hands when because that's a warm handshake in Western culture, but it's disrespectful. And so, and I wrote a book about it, all the mistakes I made. But what I'm hoping to do is, as I think of my children who are 13 and 16, I want a better church for them in the future. And so I have a unique vantage point. My background in my academics is in New Testament. I'm Westernized just growing up, but I've been in the Korean church now for more than 30 years. And so I am able to put together what I think would be a better hybrid. And so there's many great things in the Korean church. There's many great things in the Black church. There's many great things in the Latinx church. And I'm trying to bring that all together so that we can have a Revelation 5, Revelation 7 church, which I think every culture has positive things, but also every culture has aspects that are fallen. So I'm trying to do the cherry with the pits method, where I get the fruit and spit out the pits. That's what I'm trying to discern. So I'm trying to create an ecclesiology or a church methodology that my kids will want to go to, not only because it's gospel-centered and it's attractive, but it's something that would fit into their regular life as they are navigating within society here in Southern California.
So what are those pits? I mean, obviously, these examples are examples, right? Because they're situational. We're not just talking in kind of stereotypical ways. But in your experience, what would you describe are some of those pits that you've kind of seen?
The first one that comes to mind is maybe, and I don't think this is intentional, Daniel, but I think there is an ambiance of misogynistic tendencies in the Asian church in general and perhaps in the Korean church. So knowing this, one of the things that our church did this last month, which maybe many of you didn't know, March is Pastors' Wives Appreciation Month. And I don't know if you guys knew that. Most of the people don't. So I advertise that. I assign that to my students in class. You must celebrate pastors' wives. We just heard some great talks prior to this panel about how pastors' wives are suffering. And they're not highlighted. They're not celebrated. They're not honored. And so when we have 3 pastors' wives in our English ministry, and when we asked them to come up and we handed them flowers and a gift card, they were shocked. But this is something that I'm trying to get our church to do so that we celebrate not just pastors, which is in October. We got that very generously, but pastors' wives now every March. And I said, this is something we're going to do every year to celebrate women. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to show in practice, is the equality of men and women, both created in the image of God.
So I want to move to where Sam was giving all kind of passion for these things, right? Just in terms of
That comes from my heritage too, the passion.
in terms of thinking about, because Ben's been talking about this as well. In terms of reaching out to the neighborhood, to the city, beyond, right? Even as we have our ethnic specific kind of ministries in a sense, like what are some of the things you've seen Korean American churches do well, or just struggle to do in a sense, right? Or even in your ministry, if you want to talk about specific ways in which you feel like you're moving beyond ethnic spaces, right? It's not so much the fact that ethnic churches are, I think they have their role. It's just that we want to continue to kind of look at who are our neighbors, who are the neighbors that we are called to love. So why don't we start with you, Ben, just kind of thinking about that, and then I'll go to Kevin, because I think Sam's gonna get too excited, so I'll let him brew a little bit.
One of the things that bothers me is when churches have a certain name and they're the antithesis of that. So you say, this is a gracious church and it's very legalistic, or it's a loving church, but it's very cold. So in the past, I was part of a church that had the word open in it, okay? And it didn't invite anyone to come in the neighborhood. And so when we finally opened up the church and had a banquet for the neighborhood, which was primarily Hispanic at the time, they came in and said, wow, we've always wanted to come into the church. So I think what I would press upon is to try and get our churches to invite the community to come in, to lavish them as we lavish our own people, and to bless them so that they would go back into the community and go, wow, there's a reason that this church is here. They want to be a blessing. A lot of times churches just take up space on a corner and they become fortresses. We don't want that. We don't want to be insular. And I think if we have English speakers or even Spanish speakers or people who are multilingual, there's not really any good reason to be so isolated and insular. So I think we need to branch out with invitations. Food is always a great invitation. Our church right now, we're opening up something called Dreamland. It's pretty interesting, and we're going to have a lot of open facilities, and we're hoping to eventually invite the community to play basketball. And there's a putting range, and there's a train, and all these cool things. And I'm like, wow, great vision by our senior pastor, and he's first generation. So I think that is something that I'm trying to follow, and that I'm going to try and have our congregation be involved with so that we can bring people in who are non-Korean.
Just opening up the campus in a sense, right?
Yeah, I think I want to go back to the story that I shared earlier about, it was hard to embrace my own identity as a Korean in a Korean church. I don't know why. Maybe some counselors can help me with that. But yeah, I think I always wanted to do ministry like American churches. And I thought I had to be fluent in English. So, whenever there was something that I had to do, I would practice the pronunciations more than the content. But when I came to Saddleback, they actually liked the fact that my accents will slip out. And I have the privilege of hosting our service online. And I know that I represent that part of our spiritual family. We have a lot of Asian American people who are attending our church, both physically and online. So people like it when I get my grammar wrong. People like it, and I feel valued for that. And the reason why I'm sharing that as a part of a strategy for outreach is because when they see me, imperfect as I am, they feel welcomed. And they want to come to the church. And hopefully, what I'm praying is that they would see that not only for the church, that the church welcomes them, but it will actually translate in their mind that Jesus actually welcomes them as they are. So I think that's been something that I've learned. Yeah.
Kevin, I'm curious about this. So there are a lot of actually Korean Americans who actually are not going into Korean American churches, like English ministries or not, and they're actually serving in Saddleback or white mega churches in a sense. What has been how has that discernment process been for you? And was it like a little bit here and there and kind of ending up in Saddleback, or because obviously even a lot of Korean Americans and Asian Americans go to Saddleback as well. But I'm thinking about just more of a staff from your perspective for your journey. Yeah. How is that discernment process?
Yeah, I never imagined or thought that I would be serving at Saddleback. My whole I got called. I felt the calling of the Lord to be a pastor when I was in 8th grade. It was at a Korean American church. I wanted to be at a Korean American church for my entire life. So I came from a big Korean mega church. Then I went to a very small church plant. There were 2 high school kids, and I felt God's leading there. So I spent some time there. And then someone asked me, actually a 2nd generation Korean American pastor who was serving at Saddleback, approached me and asked, hey, do you want to intern at Saddleback? And I was praying about transitions, and it was one of those things that I never thought I would say yes to, but at the same time, if if it was to be an act of faith, the answer should be yes. So I said yes. I wanted to go in, maybe spend a year and put it on my resume, I served as an intern at Saddleback, and then go back to the Korean American church. But I think out of my love for Korean American churches, I actually saw that when I came out of the Korean church context, I could help more in some sense, because there was no bias. Like, if I realized that if you are a pastor of this church, these Korean churches won't come to that event. If this church hosted something, these sets of churches wouldn't come to that event. But, as me, I'm outside of that context, so people can come together in some sense. So I saw that, hey, like, even as a person outside of the Korean church context, I can help them even more effectively.
I mean, I think this is something that we're seeing, right? A lot of Asian Americans trying to figure out, and also because a lot of white churches are trying to figure out how they diversify. So they bring other people and saying, how do we kind of minister to people who are already coming? Yeah. No, thank you for that. So Sam, tell us, how did you end up with pastoring a Hispanic church?
Yeah, predominantly Spanish.
Yeah, what happened? What was this journey like? I mean, how many years it taken? I mean, because obviously you didn't plan it this way, but what happened?
So for the past 5 to 6 years, we've been getting more and more Hispanic members from the community, and I'll tell you how that happens. But before I go into that, I want to kind of give you a little context. So my question that I had about our church, that I was thinking and I'm praying about, is how is this immigrant church, not talking about English church or American church, how is this immigrant church glorifying Jesus in our community? Because the immigrant church, they do really well glorifying Jesus in the mission field. In other places too, I'm not going to take that away. But how are they giving glory to Jesus in the community? Because upon doing some research, and I think this is very important for us to do this, reaching out to our community, you ask them about, hey, what is our church to you? And overall, I had some very negative comments. One of the things that I'm learning from them, because they were there, they historically are in the community. I wasn't.
East LA, right?
Yeah, East LA. And basically they said, well, when the church was in the heyday, when Kim Uyeon Moksa님, right, the former, the pastor that was there, the founding pastor, the church was so large, even our huge parking lot was not enough. So they were parking all over our community, making a lot of noise. And then, the neighborhood, they were just like, oh, what are these people? They're just making a lot of noise, making a ruckus, making our, Sunday mornings a place of disturbance. And then they asked, what is this church doing for our community? And not only that, when there was that split, there was some major stuff that was happening. The community was seeing policemen go in back and forth and a lot of loud noises. And they're like, what is this place? Really, as they were going back and forth, the church, the physical church, was actually a place of mockery. That had to change. To me, that had to change. And so what I did was I was starting to think, what can we do with the Korean church to change our image? And one of the things that I wanted to also highlight, because, I'm saying some negative things, but I want to say some positive things. One of the things that I've noticed about the Korean church, the Korean immigrant church, our Appa church, right, is that they have a deep, compassionate heart. Many of the homeless ministries, and many of these compassion ministries didn't start with the second generation. If you look at Yongnak, even a lot of the church, the ministries that they did for the community was actually started by the first generation, which is crazy. I didn't know that. So I partnered up with our Korean church. We started reaching the homeless, but it was too far away. So we started reaching the immediate community because we have so many. And like, 장로님, 집사님, how come we're not going and reaching the people right here? And for whatever reasons, we were having a lot of things going on at our church, and they didn't continue the homeless ministry, but we did. We took that part and we started reaching our community, and that pretty much started the process. And since then, we started giving showers to the homeless in our community. We actually built a mobile shower trailer. And since then, gave about 1,500 showers to the homeless in our community. And people are starting to now hear about this news. So people started visiting because of the good things that this church is doing. At this point, it's not even about EM or KM. It's about this church. They're like, this church is doing this. And as I was doing this, I think I started getting a little bit of traction from our city officials. And they started supporting and started connecting with me. Hey, Sam, would you like to give COVID testing at your lot? We have gave over, I can't even count, at least over 5,000. And we're still a COVID testing site today. I couldn't do that on my own, but with partnership with the city, I was able to, make these things happen. And so now through that, people are hearing. Not only that, during COVID, what happened was Department of Health Services reached out to me and said, hey, Sam, we don't have any place to distribute food. And I asked the elders, let's really do this. Let's really distribute this food because they don't have a center. We became the center of food distribution in Northeast Los Angeles. We gave over 700,000 meals from our property. 700,000. And so with these kinds of, doing good in the name of Jesus, because when I see the gospel, the Lord always does good and then he preaches. Doing that and following that model, we started really shifting the image of what this immigrant church was in the community. Now we matter. We matter now. If we go, we matter now. This is a really not only a church, but it's a church that is doing community work. And I'm just scratching the surface. There's so many. We've held El Sereno senior, meetings there. We have voting there. We have so many things that are going on in our church for the community. And so with that, that's how we started growing. And now it's really growing like really rapidly. And I think for 3 members of our community that are Hispanic that visits, we get 1 Asian visitor. So that's the ratio.
I mean, it's an amazing story. And I've heard this before, so second time hearing it, it's even better. Let's kind of, as we think about the future, because there's so many things that we all shared in terms of the gifts you bring and basically all the ways in which the Korean American kind of church growing up there has formed you and given you gifts. What are your hopes for the future of the Korean American church? Whether it be, and as you think about your friends, your kids, or whoever, right? What are your hopes for the future of the Korean American church? Why don't we start with Ben, and then we'll kind of go. So, what do you think, Ben? You mentioned this already. A church for your kids, right? The kind of church that you want for your kids. What does that look like? What do you dream about?
So my general answer is a healthier church. And
as opposed to what?
As a not so functional church, which could mean siloed off, which could mean gaps, which would mean not a lot of respect for each other. So I would hope that there would be a more united front. And I would hope there would be more shared spirituality because there's lots to learn from both sides. I can say I've learned so much. You mean
like EMK? Are you talking about that way?
Yeah, I'm talking about, in my context, it's an EMKM. So I learned so much from the KM, and I'm really thankful for that. And I think I just give props to my KM congregation. They're learning a lot from us, I think, and it's been very healthy. I think this is the most healthy Korean church I've ever been in. This is my 3rd church that I've pastored. And again, I attribute a lot of that to our senior pastor who's given so much to me and to our congregation. They asked us to be independent during the COVID, and I wasn't expecting that. And I said, wow, are you sure? And they said, sure, here's some money. And we're like, whoa, okay, thank you. God bless you. And then that released us to be more responsible. And now it was a growing moment. So we grew up. So I think a healthy church means that we allow each other to grow, to mature, and then from our strengths then to contribute back to each other. So that's what I'm envisioning.
Thank you. Kevin, what are your thoughts in terms of just the future? Because obviously you can think about your friends or just your generation, what you see.
I think what would be very helpful is if the first generation Korean American churches really champion the next generation. I think that's a very cliche now of, 다음 세대 is the 주인공 of this church. We say that a lot, but I think, if you look at the American workforce, millennials are now the majority, generation-wise. People who are in their late 20s to early 40s, they're the majority who move the American economy. And yet, if you look at Korean churches, I think we lack that. So, I think for a lot of Korean churches that I've experienced, it's hard for them to see outside of their Korean church context. It's very hard to see it. So maybe look within and see if there's any generational gaps that people can fill. Maybe allowing the next generation to have more voice in how the church should be run. And I think when you were saying that, I was agreeing with you. I don't think not because I was at Saddleback, because I think I just relate as who I am as a millennial living in America. And I think if the church gives that key to the next generation, the millennials and the generations coming up, I think hopefully that would come more naturally. So I think that would be my answer.
That's like across the board, right? Not only the Korean American church, but churches across the U.S. altogether. Thank you. Well, Reverend Sam?
Yeah, and Kevin, if they don't listen, sometimes you have to be gangster, I'm just kidding. Well, sometimes I had to kind of push real hard, because sometimes it's really difficult for the elder generation to listen to the younger. They look at me and they're like, oh, this pastor, I don't want to say what they're thinking, but anyways, like for me, what I would love to see is the Korean church, the Korean immigrant church, the beautiful Korean immigrant church, and the next generation church coexisting in vision mission, not only to the world, which I know the Korean church does really well, but in our own backyard. So I think that's something that I'm trying to really work with the Korean church to do is, 목사님, you go 3,000 miles away and you're doing so much work, but there's so many people in our own backyard that needs to be saved. How are we going to do that? Right here. People can walk to our church and we're neglecting them. So maybe that may be now a model where you would have a Korean immigrant church and then you'll have a multi-ethnic, multi-socioeconomic church. I don't know. That's how it's going in our direction. I'm just thinking wherever you're at, I believe that church should reach the community for the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's kind of where I'm at. So doing that together and coexisting with the Korean church. I mean, I'm hoping that I will see kukbap forever, right? Well, as long as I'm here. As a matter of fact, we had kukbap, last week. We give options. We give chicken from EM, kukbap from KM, and guess what? I go always get the kukbap. So there is that, that power. But I really love what Ben and Kevin, what you were saying. We really do need to continue to, in order for us to do this, continue the conversation, continue the relationship. Thank God for our senior pastor, Reverend Shin, who is just so mindful and open and intelligent. We're able to sit down and have these conversations where he's able to respect my point of view, even though it's a little challenging to his ministry. Because, our backyard, there are Hispanics who used to be in hardcore gangs and that are tattooed all over the place, but they're the most gentle people who love Jesus. Could you imagine them sharing a stall or a bathroom right next to another harabaji or a harmony, but yet we're able to do this kind of racial reconciliation work, and we're able to come together as one. Like fast forwarding many, many years, we had a really, really challenging, way of doing this. If I could just share one thing, Daniel, where really helped, okay? So one year we decided we're gonna serve, the second generation is gonna serve the Thanksgiving meal. Now we're doing this every year. We had our volunteers come and serve the meal to the harmonies and chipsanims and kwanzanims and whatnot, right? And we had all colors of the rainbow serving, including ex-gang members who were tatted up serving the harmonies. At first, they were kind of timid, but once they saw that we were serving, and these people who were so different than them, loving and caring and giving, that's when really a lot of the racial tension was being eased. So it's been a beautiful story. I think I'm going to write a book about it, Daniel.
Sounds great. I mean, this is racial reconciliation, LA style, right? Koreans and Mexicans. Well, you know what? We want to open up our time for questions. So if you see that you can actually text your questions to here. I think we can also have questions from the audience here as well. You kind of have a better understanding of where they're coming from and what they're thinking about, but you can actually take the conversation in a totally different direction. So, feel free to text your thoughts and questions. There you go. Okay. Here's a question. Somebody says, I want to know how they are thinking about women leadership at church. They really accept women leadership equally compared to Korean authoritarian pastors of the first generation. I wouldn't say all Korean American pastors are authoritarians, but I think they get just what they're talking about. Just in terms of just gender roles and affirming women, just in terms of ministry, what does that look like for your churches and context, and how does it show up?
Yeah, for Saddleback, we were part of the Southern Baptist Convention. So, I think there was when I got there 6 years ago, there was a tension between the term pastor, because I was a small group pastor, and we have small group minister who's a woman. We do the same thing, and yet I'm the pastor and she's a minister, and the pay is different. The benefits you get through the government is different. Things like that has kind of really brewed lots of tension. So this is public, but Pastor Rick ordained 3 women pastors this past year. Wow. Which is a huge, huge thing for SBC and for a big church like Saddleback. And for me to explain that, I won't do justice for that, but it's available if you go to saddleback.com, and you'll see Pastor Rick really ordaining 3 women pastors. So I think we are in the trajectory of valuing men and women equally in ministerial roles.
Here is another question about what about your opinions about the new generation regarding media and technology? How do you engage media and technology in your ministry? So how do you see that as you minister to later generations that are just, think about technology, social media in a very different way? I mean, I guess that's your job, right? So
yes. But did you guys want to talk about the men and women roles? Okay. I think social media, internet, technology, media, all of that stuff could be something that you hand off to the next generation as you want to empower them. Because it's very hard for the first generation, older generation, to want to try to understand and do it, but the digital natives can really adopt fast. So for me, I'm considered the next generation at Saddleback, because I am younger than a certain age, but we were trying to get into this VR space, And I remember 3 years ago, I was handed a VR goggle, and there was an assignment. I had to create a small group model in a VR space. I got this, and I wasn't comfortable with it. Like, I'm younger than a lot of our pastors, but I wasn't comfortable with it. And that's when I thought, oh, like, our next hire should be significantly younger than I am. So in online ministry, we have a 36-year-old. I'm 33, 32, actually. I was just in Korea, so I was talking in Korean age, 32. And then our next hire was 25, and our next hire is 21. Wow. So I think we did that very strategically. And what the church needs to do is not tell them how to do it, tell them the vision and mission behind it, and they'll figure out how to do it. So I think that could be something that the first generation can hand off to the second generation.
Very helpful. Thank you. That's a great question here. How are you thinking about the third generation? What lessons have you learned as 1.5 or second generation that can help you think about ministry for the third and subsequent generations? I mean, that might just be even thinking about the broader Asian American context as well that Sam, you mentioned, but and also Ben, you talked about as well. But I mean, when we think about third generation, like your kids, Ben, because obviously they're like third generation a different way, right? But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, as you think about the lessons we've learned in terms of generational shifts, not only kind of generation shifts in just American culture, but also in terms of immigrant generation.
Well, I attended a lecture from your own Kara Powell from the Fuller Youth Institute. And if you've never heard of her, buy her books. She's just such an expert. So Gen Z, which is the youngest generation right now, trying to understand them. And one for my kids, but also for just the generation. And it's just so different from me. And so I have to think like a missionary. How am I going to contextualize and understand this? And here's the big takeaway from her talk. She said, the younger generation wants an empathetic church. And that's what we are not strong in. So I would say whether it be third generation ethnically or even generationally, that's what younger people want. They want empathy. I can give them theology. I can give them propositions. I need to listen to them. I need to show empathy and kindness. If you lead with that, then you might earn some social credibility, and they'll not only want to listen to you, but they'll show up at church. That's my 2 cents.
I've been doing a little research on that. And yeah, I absolutely agree with Ben on empathy. Also, what I'm coming to realize with this next generation, third and fourth, is they want clarity and impact. That's what I'm realizing. I've been getting some young folks coming on in by themselves, and I'm like, oh, well, why are you here? Oh, Pastor, I've been looking on your social media, and I'm seeing that you're making impact. I want to join a church that is making impact. I'm like, whoa. And so I've been doing a little research. I'm coming to realize that's what they want, a church that does something that makes impact. And that's very, just socially and culturally aware, right? I mean, that's what's going on in our culture today is we're always talking about, are these organizations making impact? Are they making difference in the world? And they want to see that in churches as well. And we should be the forefront, and we should be the forerunners in this.
So in that sense, I mean, thinking about it from an immigrant generation as well, do you see because a lot of second generation, 1.5 generation grew up with so much angst and frustration toward the first generation, right? So in that sense, as we look at the later generation, are there things that we can kind of think about for ourselves and saying not just the same thing for them? Do you see is there that kind of dynamic as well in terms of thinking about how can, because we talked about listening to next generation, being empathetic because we feel like we weren't getting that. We feel like we weren't getting the respect in that way. Is there that dimension as well in terms of immigrant generational aspect of it? Just a question for us to think about as well. Obviously, because we're talking about, Gen Z and that kind of social generation that I think is really, really important as well.
I'll start and you can add, but I think definitely so. I think there's a professional word for this, but I don't know. But I think every generation thinks they are better than the previous generation. I read this somewhere, but so I think the next generation will definitely feel like the Gen Z, for example, will feel like generation millennials are stubborn for sure. So I think what would be very helpful are not these major big changes and transitions within a church, like senior pastor, maybe, I don't know church politics enough to say this, but maybe church transition doesn't happen every 20, 30 years, but there will be micro transitions. Maybe it doesn't have to be senior pastors, but I think what would be helpful if there are leaders in charge. I think back to that 25-year-old, 21-year-old, someone who just graduated as the person leading online ministry at Saddleback. And my role is to empower them and get out of it and find something else to do. So I think if that happens within the Korean church context, it would be helpful.
Along the lines of Kevin, I think it's really important that we give them a voice. I think that's something that we never really had too many opportunities, right, with our, with the elders. And so, and it's also sometimes very difficult because some of the things that, the younger generation says is just, they're just so just upfront and honest. So it is kind of difficult, but we got to give them a voice, and we got to actually prayerfully consider also giving them a place in leadership, which I think we have a hard time doing. But even like, something came up in terms of, how you guys see women in ministry. That's a real deal topic right now, gender issue. I mean, this is what young people think right now, and to highlight that even for us, we, from time to time, we invite women guest speakers, and they love it. They love it when I do that. Especially professors and folks who are coming on through. Charlene Jinley has been speaking at our church, from time to time. And whenever I bring folks to the pulpit to try to have a more equal pulpit, they not only appreciate you more, but they respect the leadership more because they just feel like you're culturally aware and you're relevant, to the next generation.
One of the observations that I would want to make is the whole necessity to pivot away from programs and become more organic and relational, especially as we're kind of coming out of COVID. People were disconnected, and I don't think they want to just go and do another program. They want to be with people and relate to one another. So when people have been slowly coming back to our church, boy, they want to be together. They want to eat together. We went out this last Sunday with a bunch of people to a Chinese restaurant. And I'm thinking, when was the last time I did that? It's been a few years. And they love doing that. So I think organic, personal relationship is where the church needs to go to, no matter what culture you're part of.
What do you think is the role of seminaries for the next generation? Because obviously context is changing so fast. And there are things that seminaries have done traditionally. I think always church is trying to catch up with culture. Seminaries are trying to catch up with church. So sometimes, what does it look like in terms of kind of empowering the challenges that you're facing, but even the later generation, the next generation? What's the role of theological education? Well, you're a professor, so
yeah, I'll get into that.
We don't get to speak here. We'll be quiet.
And we're fortunate we have the president of Westminster here as well, so I'm just really happy for that. I think the seminary needs to serve the church at large. We have the resources, and we need to lean in and provide answers to tough questions. We need to provide personnel who fulfill pulpit supply for pastors to rest. We need to, whatever we can offer, we're trying to encourage and initiate that so that churches who are struggling or don't have resources can really look towards Fuller, towards Talbot, towards Westminster. And this is where I think our role needs to play into an integral partnership is what I'm envisioning. And one of the things that I'm doing now, and I teach all the practical theology classes, I am emphasizing two things: relationship and everything that I didn't learn in seminary. Because there's a lot of things I didn't learn in seminary. So now that I have the opportunity to come in, I teach about conflict resolution, leadership, relationships, personal care. And again, I learned Greek and Hebrew. I love that stuff, theology, but I needed to learn other things that are soft skills so that I could have that into the churches. And I'm trying to raise up healthy pastors, because healthy pastors will then lead healthy churches.
I think when I was going to seminary and when I was going to Fuller, there was kind of basically one model of EM. We didn't have too many options. I think for me, I tried to research a lot of churches that were doing some similar things, and they weren't. I couldn't find one, at least. I think seminaries have to give options for the next pastors to kind of craft with their giftings and with their knowledge what the second generation EMs can look like. So just kind of give them like perspectives, I think, and options, and to really teach them, okay, if you were to go this way because that's where your heart is leaning, here are some of the things that you need to think about, and here are some of the things that you can do. You can connect them with people who are doing different kinds of ministries. I think that would be really great for us to kind of equip the next generation, through the seminaries.
I mean, so that's really, really helpful. I think, how do we stay connected to the church partner and with the situation on the ground? I think is so important. As a seminary professor, one of the things that I think we've tried to really do is to, I teach systematic theology and also Asian American ministry. And since the Asian American ministry, one of the things we really try to focus on is giving people conceptual tools to think about so that they can take those with them wherever the calling may be. Because Asian American ministry 20 years ago was all about EMs. That's basically what they thought. It was supposed to be ministry for Asian Americans serving in Asian American churches. We don't teach that way anymore because I think about half of the Asian American students in our Asian American classes are not serving in Asian American context. They're serving in multi-ethnic context. And they need a whole different set of skills, whole different conceptual tools, a lot more race. So we teach a lot about race. And I'll talk about that next in my paper tomorrow as well. Just how race comes in and why we need so much of racial discussions. But also that class is actually, I think, up to quarter to a third sometimes is non-Asian Americans. So I'm teaching non-Asian Americans to make sense of Asian Americans as well, right? Because that's actually what we do. For my theology class, a lot of things we talk about is just how do we we talk about gender, even sexuality, how do we theologically think about these issues, right? Because it's out there in the world. And all the different perspectives, you want to think intelligently about these things. You don't want to be here's the Bible verses, because that's not how people are thinking about them. Whether it be about women, whether about the LGBTQ, these are real issues. And as a pastor, you want to at least be intelligent and have something intelligent to say. How do you navigate these things? Of course, we want to look at scripture and have a biblical perspective, but how do we articulate these things in a very intelligent way so we're not just pointing Bible verses, because that's not how people are thinking in the world. So whether it's that or even including racial dynamics, social economic dynamics in what we consider to be traditional systemic theology, because those things are not relevant. So we can't say, well, cover that class somewhere else. We want all those aspects of it in our regular theology classes. That's basically how seminary is changing to some degree. Well, let's, we've mentioned this, but in terms of kind of seeing the situation post-pandemic, we haven't talked about the pandemic, and we're kind of functioning and talking as though church is normal, but it's not, right? It's been kind of a crazy context in terms of thinking about the pandemic context. As we kind of think about this last question, what are your thoughts about this post-pandemic? How has the church changed? How does the church continue to have to change? And then we'll kind of wrap up with this last thought. Just in your church context, how has the church changed and also needs to change and also is going to change in the post-pandemic context?
Well, our theme for our year is breakthrough, and that was what we set out to try and do, and we explain what that means. And I think what's been challenging is that people are suffering mentally, physically, and everything across the board. So I've been doing a lot of topical messages. I'm doing a series where I talked about do not lose heart. And this last Sunday I preached about do not be anxious. And then next one will do not fear. And I think as Sam was saying, there needs to be a clear purpose for what the church is doing, but coupled with that, a lot of belonging. So we're always inviting people to come back. In the pandemic, it was comfortable to do Bedside Baptist or St. Mattress Church, where you just kind of turned on, you're in your PJs, and then you go back to sleep, or even you sleep during the message, God forbid. But all that to say, there needs to be a reason to get back to church. And I'm trying to pivot it as saying it's a relationship with God that is enhanced by relationship with one another. And so relationship is a key thing for me. And so again, I'm not trying to do some spectacular program, because programs are here today, gone tomorrow. Relationships can last. Community can be built, but it's going to take some intentionality. So in my messages, I'm trying to give some practical tools on how they can actually do this. Now, I'm old school, so I actually call people. Hey, we miss you. No guilt, no shame. We miss you. We'd love to have you back. And that's it. And so I think people have appreciated it, and actually a few people have come back because of that.
Yeah, I would echo what Ben said. Same. I've been doing the same thing as a pastor, but also what I've come to realize is that not only with the pandemic and being post-pandemic now with the war, and then also inflation, there is an increasing need. And also, when I was hearing the lecture here today, where people are really going through mental issues. The church really needs to step up and serve our community, our members, really serve them. I'm not talking about glossing it over with this and that, but really seeing one person change, whether it is from our community outside of the church or within the church. It'd be so amazing for the church to come together and to really serve like Jesus would,
I think our church context, we're dealing with two big changes, obviously coming out of COVID, but also our senior pastor is getting ready to retire, and we're looking for a successor. And I think how our pastor really gave us a vision is kind of going back to being empathetic and the essence of church and relationship within the people. He said that the the most important spiritual gifts of the next generation churches is going to be hospitality. And he said, we have to be a church that understands the pain of our community. So Pastor Rick is going through some tough health issues. And I remember we're in a staff meeting in a Zoom call, and he just cried because he sees this as the most opportune time for our church to be active, and yet he's sitting bedside because he's going through some health stuff. That just translates to the whole church, the staff, and we have to do something for the community. And he developed our thoughts to, whenever we see a pain, automatically think, how can we help? How can we help? How can we help? So similar to yours, our church, across all the campuses in Southern California, I think we distributed more food than the government did during COVID. Through that, we were able to have biggest evangelism year during COVID. So I think the key is focus on essential, what makes church. And I think next, it won't change. The essence won't change.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, thank you. Let's thank our panelists.